All right, here we go. So as people are trickling through, I quickly read off some cool facts that I found. So the first one was that in the time it takes to listen to the proclaimers, I'm going to be 500 miles, the International Space Station travels 500 miles, then 500 miles. So I thought that's a pretty cool little fact. For those in vet science, this might be of interest. Twitter was a 19th century word for an abscess on a horse's foot. The more you know. Yeah. And the reason why Churchill looks so grumpled on the £5 note is that the photographer just took his cigar. So yeah, been at it. And shuttlecocks used in professional badminton are made of feathers from the left wing of a goose. Apparently if they use the right wing feathers, it spins the wrong way. So yeah, maybe there's just a lot of geese with just feathers on the right wing. I don't know, probably hard to fly. All right, so yeah, probably still wait a bit more. I only just gone 10:30, get a few more attendees in. I've got two more facts. So a person who was invisible wouldn't be able to see anything. So yeah, maybe if you are wanting to be the invisible man, just keep that in mind. And finally, and kind of scientific, ice cream is a solid, liquid, and gas all at the same time, apparently. Yeah, not really sure how that works, but more you know. Okay, so that's enough facts. So kick off the day. Welcome back to day 3 for those of you that joined the previous 2 days. And if this is your first time joining, then welcome to your first day of Brain Trust. Not going to do the usual rigmarole of going through how best to use Zoom for the webinar, because our first panelist, Ryan Downey, is going to be covering that. But I will just quickly introduce Brandon, Ari, and Amy from ADI, who are going to be helping out in the background, checking the chat, doing Q&A, just being awesome and making me look good. So yeah, I will hand over to you, Ryan, and away we go. I'll stop sharing my screen so you can share yours. Cheers.
All right, fantastic, Liam. Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Ryan Downey. I'm an assistant professor at Georgetown University. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Stagecraft. And so to start off, let's take a look at the stage that we are sharing today. Most of us are familiar with Zoom here, but for those who might not be quite as familiar, we're going to start with the little buttons right here along the bottom of the screen. You've got 3 of them. You've got the chat button. You've got the Q&A button. Those are the 2 that are going to be most important today. If you go ahead and hit that chat button on the right side of your screen, you're going to go ahead and see that box pop up, and we'll be able to say hello to all the other participants in the session with us today. You can let us know where you're calling in from. The second one is going to be the Q&A button. When you push that button, that is going to pull up a window, and in that window you can ask any questions that you want me to answer during the session. And so we'll keep an eye on that as we go through. All right, with that, let's go ahead and jump in, and I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, so we're talking about the stagecraft of using best teaching practices in the real world. And so I don't have any disclosures that I need to make in regards to this presentation. And everything that I'm saying is coming out of my own mouth, of my own volition. This isn't anything that represents the position of Georgetown or AD Instruments, although I do thank our hosts for the fantastic week that they've been putting on for us. All right. Just going to pull up and move some windows around here on my screen so I can see the chat and I can see the Q&A. Fantastic. All right. For today's talk, we're going to look at 3 different things. The first part of the talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I flipped my neuro course over this summer. And one of the key aspects of flipping it was incorporating LT into that course design. And so we'll take a look at how that fit in a little bit. The second part of today's talk is some of the best practices that I employed for redesigning that course, taking it from a regular lecture course and putting it into a new flipped format. And part 3, this is the super dangerous part. I'm going to dig into some of my student evaluations, look at some of those comments, and look at what those lessons that we can take away from the experience of flipping this was. All right. Now, For each of these parts, I have a question for you all. And so if you want to go ahead, if you haven't opened up that chat window yet, you can go ahead and do so now. I'd love to hear, where were you when you got the announcement that the university was going online for the spring semester when the pandemic really started to take off? And so go ahead, think about that for just a second, put that answer into the chat, and I'll give it just a couple of seconds for you to reflect on that and start putting your thoughts together before I start talking about the flipped course. All right, I see those answers coming in, so go ahead, continue putting those answers into the chat. We'll revisit those in just a few minutes after we've looked at my flipped course here. And so before we can talk about the flipped course, let's talk about how the course was designed in what we probably would groan and roll our eyes at as a fairly typical presentation of a science course. And so this was Introduction to Neuroscience or Neurophysiology, depending on the section that they were enrolled in. It's a 15-week semester, fairly typical, met twice a week for about 2 hours. And most of the content was me standing up on the stage giving a lecture. There were weekly discussion boards that had a mix of journal articles and written prompts. The assessment for this was 4 module exams, and then I had an optional final. The way the optional final works is that if the students didn't like their course grade at the end of the semester, they could take a comprehensive final. And if they scored higher on that optional final, they'd get to replace their course grade with that comprehensive assessment final grade that they received. And so students really liked that option because it gave them the chance for redemption if they had a hiccup or two, because there was no penalty for taking that optional final. But because most of the students got through the course, only a handful of students ever chose to take that optional final. And so looking at the list of attendees, I know many of us have been here over the past couple days, hearing all of the fantastic things that we've heard Dee talking about, some of the core elements of course design. We've heard Tony talking about how essential it is to drive our learning with questions. And we've heard all of the intuitive and innovative ways that you all have been implementing LT and other methods of learning into your course. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. The summer course for Georgetown University is a little bit shorter, but we're still covering the same amount of content in those 10 weeks. And to deliver the content, I started with the neuro content from Understand Your Physiology. We heard about that on Monday with Tony. We've got 3,900 questions across all of physiology spread out over more than 160 lessons. And so I took just the neuro content, and then for each of those neuro lessons, I recorded about 32 hours of video total, broken up into about 3 to 5 minutes each. And so for each page in the lesson, I would go ahead and insert one of those videos talking about the core concepts that were present and reinforced by the questions that were present in Understand Your Physiology. We met once per week for about an hour and a half, a little bit shorter because some of my direct contact time was coming through the video that the students were watching in the Understand Your Physiology. And then I'd have open office hours at least once a week. Kept the weekly discussions, and I changed the assessments. Instead of having the 4-unit exams, now there were 9 weekly quizzes over the material. All right, let's take a look at this. Monday morning, wake up in the morning, first thing. Here is the announcement that comes from me. It's been pre-set up in the learning management system, welcoming them to the week, explaining if there's any announcements, giving them a short introduction into what we're covering. And then what are the key questions? For week 8, we're looking at control of movement and autonomic behaviors. And so we're talking about the basal ganglia, we're talking about the cerebellum, we're talking about some of the visceral responses. Their lessons are to go into LT and complete the Understand Your Physiology units that apply to the content for the week. They've got their discussion, they've got the quiz at the end of the week. And if they want, I've got some supplemental materials for them to look at in the course textbook, which I'm required to have by the university. And so here we have the Understand Your Physiology lesson. I think most of us are familiar with the way LT is set up. We've got that university branding, which is so fantastic because the students really get to see this in an environment that reflects their institution. And everything in Understand Your Physiology, everything in LT is completely customizable. So here we have that inserted video, 3 to 5 minutes of content that just jumps into the core ideas that will allow the students to really tackle some of these questions without feeling like they're too lost, without that anchor that's bringing them together. All right. While they're working on those LT modules, we've got that discussion. So for the week 8 discussion, brought in an article from Dr. Veronica Alvarez, absolutely fantastic scientist, does a lot of amazing work with the basal ganglia. And so one of the key things that I've discovered over the years is that I know who these authors are. I know that many of my faculty peers know who these authors are, but these are just names to the students. And so what I've started to do over the spring semester and then especially during the summer is to reinforce who these authors are. Let the students see that they have people in science who look like them, who sound like them, who come from places that they come from. And so diversity is an important part of the design here in picking which journal articles are used in this. All right, so they come in, there's 2 parts to this. They have a deadline that they have to post their response to the paper. And then over the next couple of days, they come back and they have to comment on at least 2 of their peer interactions. And this double deadline gives them the deadline first for going in and putting in their thoughts. And without that first deadline, everyone would be waiting until the absolute last minute to come in 11 o'clock at night. No one wants to be awake. No one wants to be doing this. And it spreads out the timeline a little bit to really allow them to develop some in-depth thought and feedback with their peers. All right. Now we come to Thursday. Everyone's excited to get into the live class session. Here's my agenda for week 8. We come in, we're talking about a paper that they've looked at for the primary motor control, the Graziano paper looking at motor intentions. We needed to come back in week 8 to revisit one of the key critical ideas about vision that the students just didn't quite get. And so I was able to build that into the session. And then took a quick break. We had a chance to go into breakout rooms. I designed an activity about decussations that they were able to go through. We talked a little bit more about movement before the students led the discussion, looking ahead a week. How do we initiate behaviors? All right. And so this flows through the content, both what we're talking about in LT. We've got plenty of opportunities for the students to ask questions. And we've also got some practice questions before they go and take the quiz. And so lots of different ways of engagement and interaction for the students as we move through the class agenda. All right. And so Liam, we've got this question flipping the course. What are some of the interesting places that we've seen our attendees when they found out that the university was going online for the spring semester?
So yeah, looking through the chat, quite a few people were in the office. Patricia, who gave a talk yesterday, was on sabbatical in Australia. So that's slightly out of the office, you could say. Dee was partying it up at on spring break. So so yeah, seen a lot of people, either on campus in the office or some people at home. So yeah, but I'd say by far office would be the predominant or majority for people.
All right, thanks so much, Liam. I see some questions in the Q&A. Terrence asks, for the summer course, it seems like the videos were about the same amount of time that might have been given in class lecture. Did I assess how many of those hours were the typical student watched? Unfortunately, the setup for the LT, this is before the analytics were made available. I understand from the LT team that those analytics are going live soon. And so I have absolutely no idea other than the students self-reports how much time they spent watching the videos, Terrence. That's really a fantastic question that I would love to dig in more, because when we use something like Echo 360 or Panopto, they give us the minute by minute breakdown. We can see where the students are rewatching. We can see lots of interesting information there. And so I'd love to be able to spend a little bit more time with the analytics from this to see how the students are interacting. Sanjay asked, how long did it take to convert the summer course from pure face-to-face to flipped? That is absolutely an amazing question, Sanjay. It took forever. For each hour of video, not only did it take about an hour to record the video, which then got broken up into the 3 to 5 minute segments, but there's also the edit time, there's the processing time as the computer has to take all that video and put it into the right format to insert into LT. And so for each week's worth of content, I'd say that I was spending between 8 and 12 hours. And this really comes to the point where one of the first things I was told when I first started teaching was you only have to be a day ahead of the students. And that is so true under most circumstances. But in this case, it really means that you're a week or a week and a half ahead of the students because of that lead in time and the amount of time that you need to give the students so that they can have the time built into the schedule to watch the videos, to go through the questions, and to be able to work on that. And D asks, were the quizzes in LT or in Canvas? The quizzes were built in Canvas. One of the things that Georgetown has been emphasizing is trying to create a uniform testing environment for the students across all of their courses. And so at the program level, at the graduate school level, this was decided that most of the assessments or all of the assessments were going to be in Canvas. Now, LT does have some fantastic assessment options, and I hope to be able to employ those more in the future. All right, so that's part one, talking a little bit about flipping the course. Remember to go ahead and continue asking those questions here in the Q&A box. And for part two, using best practices. I think many of us were caught a little bit off guard when we had to suddenly switch modes in the middle of a semester. And so what was the best piece of advice that you got when you took your classes online? So go ahead in that chat window. What were some of the best pieces of information or advice that you got when the announcement to move online was? Give you just a second to think about that question. All right, I see those answers starting to flow into the chat. Please continue to put those best pieces of advice that you got, and we'll look at some of the things that I used to consider when I moved from this pandemic pedagogy, this by the seat of the pants, moving from in-person to online for the spring semester, to designing intentional pedagogy for the summer. All right. And the first thing that I start with is going to come from the world of improv comedy. The yes and. One of the first things that we learn as scientists is that there are wrong answers. When you're standing in front of your dissertation committee, it's so easy to feel about that big that you are the smallest person on the face of the planet, as that one committee member just tears apart everything that you've done. And as educators, that's really not what our goal is. Our primary goal is to facilitate learning with the students. We want them to be able to explore those wrong answers. We want to be able to put those wrong answers out there, and we can work within the limits of their safety in the classroom so that we can get to the limits of what the students know and start to push on those limits. So here's the thing. Yes and doesn't always work because in science, there are going to be wrong answers. The way that I approach this when the yes and doesn't work is to try the phrase maybe, but have you considered? This can be a powerful way to reorient the discussion away from the wrong answer and get the students the opportunity and the space so that they come in and they can examine where their logic lied in the original answer that they gave and maybe come to a new conclusion. All right. So that yes and is that reminder to always come in and make sure that we're facilitating learning, that we're building the students and allowing them to express themselves in a way that allows us to get to what they know and push on that. All right. Now, when we're in front of a live audience, we want to listen more. And this is such a hard thing. When we're on stage, when we're in front of people, when we're even sitting in a lecture, listening to people give that lecture, maybe we're thinking about the question we want to ask, and we're phrasing that question just so perfectly that we're not quite catching all of the details of what the speaker is actually saying because we don't want to sound like a fool in front of everyone who's in the audience when we ask our question, right? Listening is so important for both the instructor that's leading the discussion as well as the students. And when we move from a lecture session to a flipped learning environment, this is even more important that everyone stays present and everyone stays flexible as we move through those live sessions. Now, one important part of listening more for the instructor is to remember that students need to be heard and they need to have the voice in the classroom. Now, this might be through discussion boards, this might be through scheduled question and answers. Open office hours work great. One thing that I ask my students to do is at the beginning of the semester, send me a music video link for YouTube or their favorite platform. And I put together a playlist. And so every time we have an intro into class, whenever I'm pulling them back from breakout rooms, I hit play on that playlist. And it allows the students to hear a little bit of themselves in the class design there. And so those little details make that a fantastic way for the students to know that they're being listened to and that they're represented in the class. That idea about the music videos comes from Jeff Shinsky. I heard about that at the APS, American Physiological Society Institute on Teaching and Learning this summer. It's worked absolutely amazingly. Every time I've used that, the students love it so much. And so give credit to Jeff for that fantastic idea. All right. Teamwork, collaboration. The word that the students never want us to use, group work. All right. As the instructor, are you the sage on the stage or are you the guide on the side? And one of the things that as we're going through, we want to invite the students to be learners with us rather than students learning from us. All right. Learning is a collaborative environment. When I'm in the classroom talking with the students, the first answer that I have to questions is most often going to be the best answer. And I'm going to be completely honest, somewhere between 30 and 40% of the time, the students ask these fantastic questions and my answer has to be, I don't know. And the first couple times that the students come across this, they expect the sage on the stage. They expect someone to come in and have all of the answers. And it's really one of those things that the students need to get used to a little bit, that learning is a collaborative environment, that I am working on the material, I'm developing the material and advancing my own mastery in these topics at the same time they are. I'm just a few steps ahead of them in the experiences that I've had that have put me in the instructor role rather than the student role for leading the class. But that doesn't change the fact that I am a student along with them. And so that brings us to creating these moments for interactions across the class. We want to be conscientious of both the instructor to student interactions as well as the student to student interactions. We want them to have the chance to talk to each other, to develop those ideas to each other, and then get feedback from the instructor before we just come in with the answer. Because as we heard numerous times already this week, that failure, that a chance for the students to come in and explore those ideas and get the wrong answer and discover for themselves why it's the wrong answer, that learning can be so powerful. And many times it's more important than the learning where we just give them the right answer. All right. Now, as soon as we're in front of a live audience, we need to allow for spontaneity. What is the energy of the class? And I have so much sympathy for anyone in America right now who tried to teach today, because I can guarantee you that almost no one was focused on class if they were actually trying to get through real content. And so you need to follow that energy. When putting together those class schedules, when putting together those agendas and those ideas for what you want to do with your time in front of the students and discussing with the students, you need to allow time for flexibility. You need to improvise when things don't work quite right. Sometimes the tech will break. Sometimes someone can't get unmuted. You might have an internet dropout and you might need to relaunch the Zoom meeting or the Microsoft Teams meeting, whatever video conferencing platform you're in. And so you need to take into multiple accounts of this when you're putting together your schedule, not only for the tech, but also for those spontaneous moments where the students are going to drive their own interest. You might be able to follow their questions into a really detailed area. And it doesn't mean that you have to skip content in other areas. Sometimes it might. And knowing where you can skip that content and allow the discussion to unfold and follow that through the student passions is going to be one of those powerful ways that you can give the students voice. All right. One of the things that I've discovered is that the students sometimes need permission to be creative. The first time that I put them into Google Jamboard, which is a whiteboard environment that the students can go in, they can draw on, they can put sticky notes, they can come up with a collaborative work. They absolutely panic just a little bit, because how often in class do we give them the chance to draw, to play, to express themselves through different modes of the creativity? And so the students not only need the permission, but they also need the framework to guide them just a little bit the first few times that you introduce those sorts of activities. By the end of the semester, they're 100% on board. They know what's coming when you launch a Jamboard, or when you start handing out in the days of when we could be in class, when you pull out the big rack of whiteboards and start handing them around with the markers. The students know what's going on by the end of the semester, but the first time, you need to give them a little bit of structure for that, and then step back and see where they take it. All right. The last thing for spontaneity is that you have to be accepting of failure. You can't ever shut down the students. You have to know that not only is the failure going to occur on the student parts, but there's going to be times where you're going to make a mistake. I know I do it all the time. So sometimes I'll be talking about the anatomy of the nervous system, and rostral and caudal, referring to the head and the tail, those two words get mixed up so easily. And the students are like, did you just say what I think you said? And it's like, yes, that's probably what I just said. And you're absolutely right. So not only be accepting of what the students are going through as they work through their different troublesome learning moments, but also be accepting of your own failures when they develop, because they do happen. All right. Now, the last point that I want to cover here is keep things to the point. This first bullet point that I have here, I absolutely shudder every time the med students ask me this question. What is the high yield from this, Dr. Downey? And the word high yield makes me just cringe on the inside, because, well, of course it's you need to know this. It's interesting, it's relevant. We need to know this to understand the next 4 concepts that we're going into. But the students don't always have that insight into the larger picture. And so the students frequently demand what the high yield information is. And we need to reinforce the relevancy of their learning on a regular basis through the contextual references and examples that we see. Dee yesterday gave us some fantastic ways that we have clinical cases that can be brought into our learning examples. All right. The point here is that if the students don't understand what the value of their lesson is, what the value of their activity is, the students are going to have low buy-in. And when we have low buy-in, there goes our engagement, there goes our live session. All right. So Liam, what are some of the ideas that we saw from our attendees today that represent the best pieces of advice that they got when they took their classes online?
Yeah, so there was some themes, commonality between keeping things nice and short. Don't be a slave to perfection. You kind of just make sure you get things out there. A bit around recording. So Rob was saying, yeah, don't just record normal lecture. Ash, who's actually up next presenting, had a good one about recording in PowerPoint so that you can edit just one slide instead of having to record an entire presentation or post-publish edit, which I thought was quite nice. And there's also, yeah, about using polls in Zoom to get engagement. Donna was saying, yeah, to play around with engagement. There's also, Burhan was talking about assessment and kind of going for more but shorter assessments or exams. And Patricia just chimed in about inclusivity and making sure to have closed captions in the videos that you're making and to double check those captions before you publish.
All right, fantastic. I really like the ideas that you all are contributing here in the chat. We've got some powerful ideas. We've got not only the big pieces of software like Panopto, like Zoom, like Echo 360 that we can record in. Sometimes those simple tools like the record feature in PowerPoint are going to be the most effective. So let's not overlook those simple tools that we might have forgotten about in the back of our brains. Patricia, that inclusiveness and that accessibility is so important, making sure that everyone has access. The one thing that I would highlight about doing the closed captioning is that if your software automatically does the closed captioning for you, you need to go back and do the editing on that closed captioning, because scientific terminology sometimes comes out as chop sushi when it's trying to figure out what these terms are. And good luck for whoever's trying to program the AI in Zoom or DragonSpeak or whatever closed captioning software you're using when it gets to some of those scientific terms. So some fantastic ideas coming in from the chat. Thanks so much. I've got some questions here. Terrence wants to know, with regard to being present, what policy did you have regarding video, or assuming the live lesson is remote? And then he also wants to know, did you have this regulated by the university? And so Terrence, the personal policy that I have is that if you're in class and you're able to do so, because with your internet connection stability and you're in a place that you can do so, please turn on your video. But I understand that sometimes you are going to be in a cafe where you are sharing a public Wi-Fi and you don't have fantastic internet, and the only way that you can stay logged into class is going to be by turning off your video. Sometimes you might have your 3-year-old kid running around, and today is the day he's decided that he's going to strip naked. Please turn off your video, because no one wants to see that. I mean, it's cute in family albums, but in the middle of class, we can go ahead and we can acknowledge that we're all working from home right now. And so in terms of a video policy that I have, I like to be very flexible about it. So some days you're just not feeling it. You have that Zoom fatigue. You come to class and it's just like, I can't be in front of the camera for 2 hours here. And that's perfectly fine. I let the students turn on the cameras, turn off the cameras when they need to. One thing that I'll add to that is that when I send them into breakout rooms, I do ask them to pay particular attention to turning on their cameras while they're working with their fellow students so that they can see each other. Now that we're entirely 100% remote, we now have cohorts that aren't getting to ever meet in person. And that face-to-face interaction is even more important now. So while I'm talking to 25 or 30 people at a time, it doesn't matter too much to me if 1 or 2 or 3 people have their cameras off. But when you're in that small group talking to each other, talking with your peers, I think that's super important. All right. As far as a university policy, Georgetown hasn't said anything yet. Burhan wants to know what size is our group of class. The classes that I'm dealing with on the small side are 15 to 20 people. My classes go all the way up to 160 people. The example that I gave you for the flipped neuro course that I'm talking a little bit about, and I'll come back to in just a minute. In the spring semester, I had 49 people. Over the summer, I had 35. And looking ahead to spring 2021, currently I have 32 enrolled. And so this is a good size class. This is going to be an average size class for a lot of universities, but we can also come back during the social session later this evening or later this morning, depending on where you're located. And we can talk a little bit more about how to scale some of these ideas if you're teaching those larger classes. And Leslie, I don't like what is high yield as well. Fantastic. I'm right there with you. Can I give an example of how I answer that, especially online when students are not engaged until that question comes up? The best thing that I have for this, Leslie, is that week 1, week 2, these are the weeks when students are still trying to figure out what the course is and how the course is going to go. And those expectations you set at the very beginning of the course are going to drive the course forward when you get to week 8, when you get to week 12, when you get to week 15. And so at the very beginning of the semester, one of the key rules of my classroom is that any question you have, please ask it. If I don't know that you have a question, I can't try to address it in any sort of meaningful way. Even if that question is this going to be on the exam? And I try not to have those sarcastic answers like, well, it wasn't, but it will be now. Because those questions don't have that right sort of environment that I want to build into the class, that sort of environment where the students can come in and be able to discuss anything that they want, that they can explore any aspect of their learning and those limits of their knowledge that they want. And so when the students reach that point where it's like, do we have to know this? Sometimes it's just like, you know what? We're going to take a step back from the content and we're going to revisit the metacognition, the elements of learning that, how is this scaffolded? Remember last week we looked at how the neurons were communicating through the synapses. Now we're looking at the synaptic plasticity for the how the synapse strength changes as we go through learning and forgetting. And next week, when we come back, we're going to start to use these functional neural microcircuits to build the interesting things about our neural physiology. How do we hear? How do we see? How do we control our muscles? If we don't understand this piece right here in the middle, which we've built on from what we learned last week and what we're looking forward to next week, that's where we're at right now, is we have to work on this idea so that we can move forward to that future material. And so, Leslie, I don't have a single best answer for when the students get into that high yield frame of mind, but I do try to keep in the back of my mind that yes and philosophy, that mentality that keeps me present with the students and facilitates their engagement. All right. Cool. And I see that Liam has dropped a link for that social session into the chat box. And so if you want to go ahead and pop in and see what everyone is talking about, go ahead and click on that and we can go ahead and have you participate in that later today. All right, the last part of today's talk is what lessons have we learned from our summer experiment of taking things online and doing everything remotely? And so my question for you, go ahead and put that into the chat. What is the one thing that you would do differently about remote courses, knowing what you know now? So take just a second, think about that, start putting your answer together. All right. This one takes a little bit more thinking. I see you all taking just an extra second to start to put those thoughts together. And so finish those thoughts up, put those into the chat box. And let's look at some of the key takeaways that I've had from this summer. So let's start with some student outcomes. When we compare the spring cohort, which was lecture-based, and they had 4 major exams, to the summer cohort, where they had flipped learning using Understand Your Physiology, where they had these videos that were broken into 3 to 5 minute segments spaced into all of the lessons in LT. How did they do? Well, on the assessment questions that were consistent between the spring and the summer cohorts, the students over the summer performed about 5% better. Overall, because some of the questions had to change, some of the content changed between the 2 semesters, overall, the students over the summer performed about 1% better. That's not a significant difference. But I think that looking at the questions where they did have the same question between the spring and the summer, we have an interesting finding there. On the end of course evaluation, the majority of students, 26-29, found the LT material to be effective in their learning. And the majority of students, 27 out of 29, found the class activities to be effective in their learning. And so of the 35 students I had over the summer, there were 6 non-responders who didn't answer the survey. So that's where that 29 number comes from. 2 interesting things that come out of this data is that the self-report on the students, they spent more time over the summer. They reported spending about 11 to 15 hours per week on the course compared to the spring students who only reported 3 to 5 hours per week. All right. And given what we know and what the registrar tells us the students should be spending on the class, this is the first time in my experience as an instructor that I've ever seen the students self-report that they're spending this range of 11 to 15 total hours per week on a course. This includes the in-class time. This includes the time that they're spending in LT, watching the videos, answering the questions, any other studying that they're doing. And so this is the first time I've ever seen the students self-report that they're spending about this range of time on the material. And then 96% of the students would recommend the course to another student. And so take that for what it's worth. The students are answering these questions as part of the end of semester evaluation. So hopefully they're not just saying that because they think that it will help me feel better at night. All right, now, this is super, super dangerous for me. I'm doing this without any sort of strong drink in my hand. This is a comment that comes directly from one of my student evaluations. And I want to take it apart a little bit because there's some really, really interesting and useful feedback here. So this particular student, I know which student it was because we had had several conversations and I know where the these elements of this comment come from. So I think that it would have been extremely useful in having an introduction to LT before being thrown into the platform. I know that the first section of LT was an introduction, but since it was a new platform, I did not know how to process the information. So I'll stop right there for a minute. The students, when they come into a flipped class, sometimes they will only have had lecture-based courses in their experiences. And I think this is a little bit tragic. I think that we can do a better job on this across the university system as a whole of getting students more experiential learning. But this is something that we need to be aware of, that sometimes we're going to be dealing with students in the LT platform or in flipped learning sessions, that this is the first time where they have to take ownership of their own learning. All right. Now, the student continues on. Was I supposed to take notes on each section? Should I focus on bold terms? Because it is a new learning, hold on, the Q&A box needs to be moved. Because it is a new learning style, am I supposed to have a great understanding for it at the end of each page? How much time should I spend per section? All right, the students are learning a new skill here. This might be the first time that they're having to tackle this self-learning, self-driven learning. And they need a little bit of guidance, especially at the beginning. And so that communication, when we first introduce LT, when we first introduce that platform, I don't want to call it hand-holding, but we definitely need to be even more of a guide at the beginning of these courses than we would normally be. And that communication, we think that we send out those announcement emails, we get that wording just right so the students know exactly what they need to do. And we're going to have to answer 12 or 15 questions over email and in office hours, because that communication just needs to be reinforced, especially at the beginning. All right. So the student says, because of the unfamiliarity, I basically rewrote my notes containing everything from LT and could not decipher the best way to use the platform. This is something that I was able to start to interact with this particular student, and we solved somewhere around week 4 or 5. It really takes the students being able to come to you with those challenges that they're having with the platform and being able to discuss where they're at and how they're using the resources, so that we can steer them towards being efficient with their time and being efficient with their experience for their learning. So here's where things come together. Overall, I found the platform exciting and easy to manage, but I'm not sure I initially totally got out of it what was expected, and I had to spend a ton of time with the material outside of LT. I really appreciated the student-to-student interactions via discussion board, and the professor was kind and always willing to help and listen. I really appreciated his willing. I probably didn't need to leave that last little bit in there, but it does make me feel good after getting beaten up a little bit in the first half of that statement, right? So there's some really, really interesting things that are coming out of the student feedback. They need that reinforcement early. They need that encouragement and continual input from the instructor, that even though being responsible for your learning for maybe the first time in your life is scary, it's new, it's challenging, it might be difficult, but you really don't have any other choice but to push through right now, because this is the way the course is going to go. So I see some questions coming in. I see some comments continuing to come in. And so, Liam, what are some of the things that people would have done differently with their remote courses, knowing what they know now?
Yeah, so there was a lot of chat comments coming in, so I was trying to think how to summarize it. Probably the most common thread through all of it was around assessments. So just picking some randomly, Dia was mentioning moving or wanting to move from exam-like to more project-based assessments. There's mention of less MCQs, taking advantage of the tech that is available to make the assessments possible or more efficient. That term again, to try and make things less Googleable. I swear that must be a word. And that's, yeah, using more image-based questions. The design of how you do online assessments, trying to make them more engaging. And then also having more low-risk assignments or assessments, and to try and promote, the learning over the actual assessment. There are a couple of other ones around kind of collaborative learning, shifting more to group lessons in LT. Yeah, so there's a few other random ones, but I'll look to share the chat comments along with the recordings afterwards, so people can really burrow down and not be panicking that they're missing all this gold that's coming from your talk.
Fantastic. So the trade-off that I made with Liam was that I covered some of the introductory things on how to use Zoom, but I did make him work here moderating the chat a little bit harder than he might have had to work all the rest of the week. So Liam, thank you so much for continuing to monitor that chat. I've got two questions here. Sanjay wants to know, how much out of class time do I expect students to spend on the course content? Sanjay, our university registrar defines 1 credit hour as 50 minutes of direct contact. Direct contact could be video that we're requiring the students to watch, or live synchronous class time. And for every 50 minutes of direct contact time, the registrar also defines 120 minutes of outside time. And so that works out about 2 hours for every hour that they're spending in class. And when I start to see that the students are spending more time on the content, I use that flexibility and that ability to modify the live sessions to cut back on them a little bit. If I see things getting way out of hand with the students just really spending a lot of time, and again, because I was doing this without any real analytics, I was relying a lot over the summer on the students self-reporting when they were having those moments of difficulty with the learning and with the time that they were spending, to come to me and let me know. There were weeks where I would cut out entire lessons and just drop content from the course because I didn't want them spending that much time on the course. And so this summer was definitely an experience in being flexible and improving a little bit to make sure that things were flowing both how I needed them to and how the students needed them to. So hopefully that helps a little bit with the understanding of how the university defines those contact hours, as well as how I kind of had to adapt on the fly. Tony wants to know, do I have any feel for whether the depth of understanding changed for the students using LT? Tony, I really love this question. It's something that you and I have talked about many, many times. And what I'm doing now, I don't have the full analysis, is I've got every question from the spring and the summer cohorts cataloged by Bloom's taxonomy level. I'm going through right now and doing the analysis to compare how the students did on each individual question and breaking it down on the type of learning. And so I don't have a question, I don't have an answer to your question yet, but I hope to in the next couple of weeks as I make the time to finish doing this analysis. Now, anecdotally, even though I don't have the data, what I can tell you is that this summer, I had one of the most enriching experiences that I've ever had as an instructor, because of the depth of discussion that I was able to have with the students. I wasn't spending 2 hours every class period standing there talking at the students, delivering material to them. We were able to dig into the material and dive in and really explore some of those challenging ideas, especially in regards to the scientific papers that they read each week. And so my anecdotal feeling, like that kind of gut feeling that I have about things, is that the students got more out of the course than they ever have before. But I'm looking to validate that with some data as well. So looking forward to following up on that in a future discussion with you, Tony. And Leslie wants to know, what are some strategies I use to help students get to the level of SDO in a flipped class I want them to be at, given your statement that many students don't know how to take control of their learning? Leslie, the key thing that I have is to bring the metacognition of learning strategy to the forefront. And I've always had an element of metacognition and learning theory as part of my course. I mean, it's a neuroscience course. We're going to talk about how the hippocampus works, how memories are formed. but that doesn't come until the end of the course. And so I need to introduce some of those ideas very, very early in the course to get the students thinking about how they can help control their own learning. And so Tony has some fantastic resources that we've put into the introduction to understand your physiology. The readings that go into the ideas behind a flipped classroom are very, very powerful for the students to know that we're not just making this up, that this is data-driven pedagogy that we're employing here. And so by having those conversations early with the students and helping them to understand their role as a learner. There's a book, I'm blanking out on the author's name, Sandra Yancey McGuire, Teach Your Students to Learn. Absolutely fantastic book. It's one of the ones that I recommend to my grad students who are learning to teach. I will get the actual reference for that and put it in the chat once this session is over so that we can have everyone on the same page with that. All right. Fantastic. Do we have any other questions that we've had come up? All right. Well, we've got just a few minutes left before Liam pushes us onto the next part of our schedule for the day for Brain Trust. And so what I'd like to close with is a question. How do we use the best practices of teaching to build meaningful experiences and learning with our students? If it's not clear yet, I don't have any definitive answers to this question. I really appreciate everyone's contributions to today's session. Your comments in the chat, we're saving those. We'll make those available after the session, as Liam said. And we can refer to those, build off of each other's experiences. Because at the end of the day, each of us must go into the classroom, or as the case may be, our living room in front of the camera here on Zoom. And we're gonna have to figure out how to do this for ourselves. But I do have a few thoughts to leave with. So the first takeaway, we have to be deliberate and intentional with our approach to teaching. If we're trying things randomly, if we're grabbing spaghetti and throwing it up against the wall, things are gonna fall apart a little bit. We need to make sure that everything that we're doing has a purpose towards meeting those core competencies, those core concepts that we need the students to master when we're talking about the content and the skills in the course. But we also need the students to be able to master the learning and master the idea of being a self-driven learner. And the more deliberate we are, the more intentional we are, the easier that process becomes for everyone involved. Takeaway 2, we want to practice with our technology and our methods before we go live in front of students. I think we've all experienced that moment where we have the Zoom window that just refuses to launch into a share screen. We've hopefully not had that moment where you are casting a whiteboard from your tablet device and all of a sudden you start getting text messages from your significant other. And boy, the students will have fun with that if you haven't ever experienced that. You want to make sure that you're familiar with everything that you're doing before you try it in front of the students to avoid as many of those awkward situations as you can. The last thing that I have is be flexible, keep a good humor, because things are going to go wrong every once in a while, and you just need to roll with the punches. You need to adapt sometimes on the fly, and we go with it, right? You can't take it back once it's out in front of the students. And so sometimes we just need to have a good sense of humor about the fact that you're getting a sweet little text message from your wife in the middle of a session. So, all right. I wish you all good luck, good health, especially in these times, and that all of your tech works as expected during your remote teaching. I'd like to thank the folks at Georgetown University that make this possible. The Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship is a huge resource on my campus that has facilitated so much of my learning. as well as the American Physiological Society, specifically the physiology education community of practice. And of course, we need to acknowledge our host 80 Instruments. They do a fantastic job, not only providing the software that makes our job easier, but providing that backend support that makes our job easier using that as well. And so if there's any last questions, I think Liam is going to tell me that I am right at the end of my time. And so we'll look for those in the social session at the end of today's programming. And I hope to see you there. Thank you so much.
Wow. Cheers, Ryan. Amazing talk, bang on time. Yeah. And yeah, as you said, I'll be making sure to disseminate as much of the chat as possible. There was some awesome nuggets of wisdom coming through. So yeah, I just want to say thank you again for amazing chat, and looking forward to the social session where we can really dive into some of those ideas that came up. So thank you again, Ryan.